Welcome to your the Nerd Institute. Today we begin a new unit in our course on how to become a nerd. On today's lesson, we are going to be talking about strategy, tactics, and actions, and the SWOT analysis. So let's get to it, shall we? If by the end of this lesson you're only able to remember that strategy and tactics aren't the same thing, that they constitute a nested approach to conquering a goal, then I will consider myself a happy teacher. In the Seeker Slayer Survivor DLC for Pillars of Eternity 2, there are... Yes, Twitter son, what do you want?
What is Pillars of Eternity, 2 and stuff?
Fine. Pillars of Eternity 2 is an isometric fantasy CRPG, computer role-playing game, or classic if you prefer it that way, that takes place in a medieval fantasy setting. And it has had 3 expansion packs, one of which is the Seeker Slayer Survivor DLC. In the Seeker Slayer Survivor DLC, there are arena challenges. It goes without saying that your goal in these challenges is to defeat the opposing group of fighters. Now, these arena challenges are harder, a lot harder in some cases, than your average Pillars of Eternity 2 encounter. You could say that this expansion pack sought to add combat-focused content to a game that, according to some people, was lacking a combat-heavy area for players to lose themselves in and take a break from the story and its quests. The original Pillars game had the Endless Paths dungeon, and Baldur's Gate 2, after the Throne of Baal expansion pack came out, had the Watcher's Keep dungeon. If nothing else, the Seeker Slayer Survivor DLC was a clever little way to add a combat-heavy area to the game without resorting to the trope of the eerie multi-floor dark dungeon. Though I will take a dark, eerie multi-floor dungeon over an arena any day of the week. But that's just a personal preference that's neither here nor there. But I am 90% sure that we got an arena instead of a dungeon or a large new area to explore because I think it was cheaper to make. So it was just a little bit cash grabby if you ask me. And there is the fact that most of the enemies that you face in this DLC were already in the game, or are otherwise rehashes of existing enemies. Oh, and there's also the fact that you trigger the post-final boss encounters, and yes, that's a thing in this game, by fetching items from locations that already exist in the core game. So not much new stuff going on here in terms of enemy models and locations. But we are here to talk about goals, strategy, tactics, and actions. Like we said, Seeker Slayer Survivor has challenges. Let's also say that in order to conquer these challenges, you need a strategy. And this strategy has to have a tactical plan attached to it, so to speak. And of course, your actions need to be consistent with your tactics. And this DLC is straightforward, if not obvious, about the strategy it expects you to use for each of their challenges, which makes it the perfect game for this lesson. Now, imagine there is this girl you want to convince to be your girlfriend. Now also imagine that you don't quite know how to do this. That last part shouldn't be hard. So because you don't exactly know what the best plan is to woo her, you play to your strengths and do the thing that has always more or less worked for you. Perhaps you are loaded, so your plan is to impress her with your money. Or maybe you're an ace charlatan and a keen observer of human behavior, so your plan is to sweet talk your way to the back of her kitchen, if you know what I mean. But now imagine that the girl in question comes to you instead and says, "Listen dude, if you want to impress me and get me to be your girlfriend, you have to show me that you are creative, because that's what works for me." Oh, well, okay then. The Seeker Slayer Survivor DLC has 3 types of challenges, which are presented to you by the 3 aspects of the hunt, who live inside this 3-headed statue. Not surprisingly, these challenges are Seeker, Slayer, and Survivor challenges. And they are all appropriately categorized in the pool of memories, which is where you go to get these encounters started. And the game is a little bit like this hypothetical girl who straight out tells you the thing you need to do if you want to woo her. The Survivor head, for example, says this:
"Endure, and you will be victorious."
And that's your strategy right there. These fights aren't about ending things as quickly as possible, they are about surviving, in case the name of the challenge didn't make it completely obvious. Which means that your strategy is to use your resources efficiently, cautiously even, if you don't want them to run out before the fight is over. In these challenges, you don't know how many waves of enemies you're going to get beforehand, nor which enemies you're going to get, or how many of them you're going to get per wave. So it's all about managing your resources and saving as many of them as you can for when you really need them. And while using your resources sparingly is the best way to approach the Survivor challenges, it is also the quickest way to get you killed in the Slayer challenges, for example. This is how the Slayer phase of the hunt introduces his challenges.
May the most savage win!
In case you didn't get it, being savage means to come out all guns blazing and kill everyone before they kill you. The Seeker challenges are by far my favorite. In these challenges, your enemies are particularly good at exploiting your weaknesses and obfuscating their own. So the key to these fights is figuring out the weakest link in the enemy party or neutralizing their advantage, while also protecting your weakest link and making the most out of your advantages. Now let's talk about tactics. A strategy all by itself won't be enough for you to conquer your goal. You should have a plan that covers what to do with the resources available to you, how to do whatever it is you want to do, and how to adapt if things don't go the way you expect. And that is what we call tactics. In card games like Magic the Gathering or Gwent, if you don't want to be everyone's bitch, you need to have a strategy and also sound tactics. What do you want your deck to do? What's your deck's philosophy, if you would? The answer to that question is your strategy. But some people confuse strategy and tactics, and these people tend to answer this question incorrectly. What does your deck do? Well, I have this little boat card here that has the skill to spawn soldiers, so when I combine it with this other card...
Wrong.
No, don't tell me how you play your deck. Those are your tactics. Tell me your general approach to the game. My deck doesn't let you play. It destroys, steals, or neutralizes every card you put into play. That's a sound answer. My deck spawns creatures infinitely and boosts them through the roof. Also a good example. My deck is called the Ex-Wife. Is it all about control and manipulation? Yes. Fair enough. Those are examples of strategy. But if you intend to play a control deck in, say, Magic the Gathering, you probably want to go for a deck that's all blue, or mostly blue, perhaps blue-white, I don't know. If you play Gwent, you probably want to look at the Nilfgaard or the Syndicate factions. Then you'll want to choose cards that work well together for control purposes. If you're playing Gwent, you want to establish which cards you want to play in the first round, and which cards you want to play in the last round, your leader's ability, and a few other things. Tainted Grail is a game that is somewhere between ARPG and card game. This game has classes, and when you choose a class, what you are really choosing is a strategy, a general approach to the game. But it's up to you to decide which cards, consumables, and runes to use, which passive skills to acquire, etc. This game is all about your tactical plan, so you could say that this game focuses more on tactics and a little bit less on strategy. Back to Seeker Slayer Survivor then. So the Survivor phase of the hunt says,
Endure, and you will be victorious.
Okay, fine then. Our strategy will be to outlive our enemies. Gotcha. Now, how are we going to do this? Let's see. Let's start with our choice of personnel. I'm still going to use a tank, a healer, and a few damage specialists. And this party should be able to crowd control in some capacity too. I'll take Constantine. He's not a DPS beast, but... Yes, Twitter son, what is it?
What is DPS?
Damage per second. Anyways, Constantine is not very efficient or useful in fights that don't take long, but he's the absolute king when it comes to battles of attrition. He uses chants, and chants are especially good for long fights because they don't have a limited number of uses per rest, and they don't consume any resources other than time. They use phrases, and phrases just happen periodically as the chanter sings them. And they grant sustained discrete bonuses like healing, the periodic summon of a skeleton, extra damage for the rest of your companions, etc. He's also capable of summoning creatures every certain number of phrases. And since chants work like an endless loop, he'll be able to do this periodically, making him an ace crowd control and damage per second specialist for long fights. Let's choose a tank now. I've Adair, Rekka, because I've sort of built him to be a tank, and a custom-made Crusader, which is the class that results from choosing both the Fighter and the Paladin class. Rekka has turned out to be surprisingly efficient for fights that need to end as quickly as possible, because while he's not the most resilient of the lot, he hits very hard for a tank and has a lot of talents that interrupt enemy actions. And Adair is pretty well balanced too. He's decent enough as an all-purpose tank, but not quite the specialist I need for long fights. My stout Dwarf Crusader, on the other hand, needs like a year to kill anything, and his attacks seem to take forever. But damn, the man's a fucking damage sponge. and he has many heal over time and armor increase over time skills that allow him to restore health and increase his armor without having to consume resources like potions or skills with limited uses per rest. I'll also take Idwin, because she's a rogue Cipher. Cipher Talents are unlimited to a set number of uses per rest, like Wizard or Druid Talents. They use Focus, and Focus replenishes over time as you do damage, but it takes its sweet little time to replenish, which makes Ciphers not the best combatants to have in fights that aren't going to last very long in my opinion, but they are just perfect for survivor challenges. She also has the Pain Block skill, which grants +5 Constitution, +2 armor rating, and +10 health restored every 3 seconds, which comes in very handy for these fights. And since it depends on focus, she can cast that spell periodically. As for items, my tank's gonna have all the plus whatever something over time items, and the X% of incoming damage will be avoided or mitigated kind of gear, because these types of items are preferable for long fights. See, because the strategy for these challenges is to endure, I've chosen companions whose skills mostly replenish over time automatically, instead of those who have a class that have spells that are maybe more powerful but have a limited number of uses per skill per day, and gear that may not be the most efficient for short fights, but that by the end of a long fight will have brought large benefits to the wielder. Slayer challenges are of course a different story. The exact opposite story actually. You have to be savage, like most damage-based Skellige decks in Gwent, or a red deck in Magic the Gathering.
You mean like those guys who hump their cousins and stuff?
No. A red deck. With a D. A red deck consisting only of creatures that require 1 or 2 mana to summon and are unaffected by summoning sickness. I think they are calling that skill Haste these days in Magic the Gathering. To be savage in Pillars of Eternity 2, you need people who can do a lot of damage and are able to get to their targets as quickly as possible. You can also neutralize your enemies through some form of crowd control to make things easier, but that needs to come after DPS in your priority list. As far as companions go, Mirka is a no-brainer here. She hits like a train. She can mobilize quickly and has several incapacitating skills. Rekka, at least my Rekka, is probably the best choice as tank for these encounters, and Aloth is probably a good option for DPS and crowd control. And your approach to the fight has to be to focus your damage on those enemies who have less health or do more damage or have special skills that can prevent you from doing your thing. Now let's talk about the SWOT analysis. SWOT stands for Strengths, Weaknesses, Opportunities, and Threats. Every individual has them. Enterprises have them too. They are human compacts after all. Strengths and weaknesses are part of you. Strengths are talents, skills, or positive personality traits, for example. Weaknesses are flaws, problems, being a TikTok user. Opportunities and threats are external factors. It is stuff over which you have little or no control or influence, at least not directly. We have established that the survivor challenges are all about enduring, and that basically entails managing resources with a save it for when you need it criteria. Now, if I had to venture a guess, I would say that my friend Italot would ace the survivor challenges. I'm serious, he probably would be very good at them, because the guy is the king of hoarders, the emperor of saving for later. That right there is a strength, as far as survivor challenges go at least. That's the guy who never spends a skill point or a talent point in ARPGs. Level after level, he just lets them sit there until the game becomes almost unplayable. Then he decides which attributes to boost and which skills to acquire. I went to Portugal earlier this year to visit his brother and him, and I got him like 5 or 6 boxes of chocolates from my country. He had like 18 pounds of chocolate to feast upon, and the man would eat like one tiny little square of chocolate every 2 days or something like that. Again, this approach to life is perfect for survivor challenges, but Slayer challenges, for example, demand that you be a savage. And see, while I was in Portugal, Italot's birthday came up, and we bought him this nice juicy cheesecake. And, faithful as always to his save for later practices, when the singing and the celebration were over and it was time to eat the cake, he declared that he was going to save some cake for later. Later never came, of course. By the time he decided to get his share of the sweet, cheesy loot, there was nothing left of the cake but a distant, fading memory. And just like that, Italot's greatest strength had become his greatest weakness. See, he was competing in a savage challenge, A challenge that's all about coming out all guns blazing and killing everything, which means that he should have eaten his share of the cake there and then. He knew he was up against two savages who were going to show no mercy to that cake. He knew there would be no tomorrow, but he didn't change his playstyle. He stuck to his guns, played to his strengths, and failed. The moral of the story is that something that might be considered a strength in some situations may very well be a weakness in others. And whilst building your strategy around your strength is generally a smart thing to do, sometimes it just doesn't work. Sometimes challenges are more about seizing opportunities and avoiding threats than about what you are good at. I remember this one time in World of Warcraft when we were fighting a nasty troll boss called Jindo. It was a 20-man raid, one of those Soul something dungeons. And I remember getting our asses thoroughly kicked. I remember the raid bosses throwing blame around and saying, "You're not good enough for this raid, you're not healing quickly enough, or your gear sucks too much for you to be on this raid, or you should do such thing when Jindo does such other thing," and blah 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 blah. But after 3 failed attempts, someone in the Ventrilo chat said one simple phrase: "Guys, this fight isn't about Jindo, it's about his ads." A brief silence followed this phrase. It was a silent, "Oh," a magical, beautiful moment when everything finally clicked for everyone. And wouldn't you know it, we crushed the bastard the next time. We didn't even break a sweat, and it was so easy that I just couldn't believe it. And every single person in that group that day agreed that, for some reason, when this dude said, "This fight isn't about Jindo, it's about his ads," everything made sense. See, the problem had never been that we were not executing the tactics properly. It was not that these or those guys and gals weren't doing their jobs, or that they didn't have the right gear for the fight. It was a general lack of understanding of the fight itself, a strategic problem really. And more importantly, we were not failing because we didn't have the right strengths, or because we had weaknesses that made it impossible for us to succeed. It was because we had been approaching the fight the wrong way all along. Some fights are simply more about opportunities and threats. Take for example the fight against Gascoigne. No, not this drunken fucker, although he'd probably kick your ass in a fight. I'm talking about Father Gascoigne. Taking advantage of your windows of opportunity is what this fight is about. And this is more or less true of most From Software bosses. Of course, it makes a world of difference to be good at making quick-timed decisions. Of course, it makes a world of difference to have good hand-eye coordination. Nailing that parry? All the difference in the world. But even a clumsy old fucker like me, someone who has none of the strengths that make a difference in these games, and all the weaknesses that you could possibly have for From Software games, is capable of finishing games like Dark Souls or Sekiro. And believe it or not, these games won't punish you that badly for not having the right strengths or for having such and such weaknesses, but they are going to rape your virgin ass with a giant plastic horsecock if you don't identify the windows of opportunity and the weaknesses of every boss and even regular mobs. The secret challenges in Pillars of Eternity 2, like the voice of the hunt itself says, are all about identifying your opponent's strengths and weaknesses on the fly, and that's the same as saying that they are about identifying opportunities and threats. And that's why these challenges are hands down my favorite in the game. And combat-wise, these fights are amongst the most interesting combat encounters in the entire saga. I hate spiders, but this fight was awesome. I'm not crazy about spirits, but this fight was super interesting. Oozes? They are very D&D, and there's a special place in my heart for those, because this was the first D&D enemy I ever faced, and it was in a D&D Choose Your Own Adventure book back in the mid-80s. But I'm not all that crazy about them. But this fight was
amazing.
I think it's not too off to rate the level of awesomeness of a fight by the feeling of accomplishment you get when it's over. And on that respect, the secret challenges far surpassed the rest of the challenges in the game for me. I especially like that, though these fights are meant to be figured out, they never fall into the pitfall of the unsufferable cheap design of making enemies immune to every goddamn thing you do except the one thing that works. There is no, "Oh, so you don't have +6 magical weapons? Well then fuck you." Or, "Yeah, the only way to defeat this enemy is to attack it with such spell." The enemy AI in this fight is actually fantastic. These damned spiders kept making decisions that would not only counter what I did tactically, but also sought to create situations in the battlefield that would favor their strengths and exploit my weaknesses. Truly, truly awesome. Combat is the name of the game in Seeker Slayer Survivor. Yes, Twitter son, what is it?
I'm confused. Isn't like the name of the game like Seeker, like Slayer, like Survivor, like such?
But there is, after all, a story-based excuse for you to go to the island of Kasuari, which is where this DLC takes place. And almost everyone seems to agree that it sucks. I don't think it sucks all that much. Or at least, the bones of the story aren't terrible. There is an island that belongs to the god Galawain, and he explains that it is meant to be a Plan B shelter, the place where he's going to run to should Eothas succeed with his plan. Okay, not bad. Though I would have wanted to know how he was going to take shelter in the island, but okay. And there are underground savage tournaments a la medieval bloodsport going on in this island, and the premise that those who lose die and are considered sacrifices to the god of the hunt. Again, not bad. Also, there being 3 faces of the god of the hunt, which are the 3 different manifestations of Tuamawai, which is Galawain's Huana name, and the fact that they live inside a badass 3-headed statue, something good could have come out of that concept. Could have. The best way I can describe the story in Seeker Slayer Survivor is like a building that looks like this on the outside, but its apartments look something like this. The bones of the story aren't all that bad, like I said, but the dialogue in this DLC is the cringiest in the series. This ghostly dude, for example, is supposed to be your guide, but he knows less about what's going on than your average Twitter user knows about the world outside social media. And his comments and questions would make TikTokinson sound like the smartest guy in the class. Also, while the game tries to sell you that these tournaments held in Tuamawai's honor are all secret, brutal, and savage, everyone in the island seems to be oddly cheerful and positive about it. And I get vibes of a medieval fantasy version of a family-friendly soccer stadium from the place in which these combat encounters take place. And sometimes the voices of the hunt sound so much like in-game sport commentators that I couldn't help but laugh at some of the stuff they said. Constantine is the recommended companion to bring along for this entire DLC, and he is by far the worst written follower in the game, much like this DLC itself compared to the rest of the game. It's like the developers had no clue of what they wanted to do with him or what they wanted him to be. Again, much like the DLC itself. One minute he's making the worst pun jokes in the world, even by my standards, and the next he's grunting exasperately when you command him to do something. He has a lot to say to the NPCs in this game, but aside from making it clear that he doesn't have fond memories of the island, its people, or the Crucible, which is where the tournaments take place, almost nothing he says is the least bit useful. Quite the contrary, in fact, it is often immersion breaking. Constantine is supposed to be the follower who connects your character to the story in the DLC, a bit like Vanir and Edwin for the Beast of Winter expansion, but the DLC isn't about him. And aside from bitter memories of the place, he has no personal stake in anything that's going on. I will say this though, do take him along for this entire DLC, because he is the best companion to have for all the fights. I think it was a happy coincidence, but he did feel combat-wise like he was the most experienced fighter in your party. He even ended up soloing the final stretch successfully in a couple of fights. Constantine is already pretty good as a tactical asset in my opinion. He always had a spot in my party for the mega boss fights, and I brought him along quite frequently in the rest of the game. But in this DLC, he feels like an absolute boss. At the end of the day, I did enjoy this DLC for what it is, and that is additional combat sprinkled with a bit of story and lore. But even as such, I'm not sure I'd recommend it to everyone. As I said, every enemy you'll be fighting in this DLC, you have already fought before if you've played the core game. They are only made interesting by their tactics, their combined talents, the way in which they take advantage of their entrenched positions, etc. There is no exploration to be done in this DLC, and quests are all either fights or fetch quests in locations that you have already visited in the core game. It's the lowest common denominator, really. If combat is where you have found your fun in this series, and because of that, you've played it on the path of the damned difficulty, then get this DLC. You will not be disappointed. Otherwise, I fear you will be very, very disappointed with this one. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, thank you for watching all the way up until now. If you like what you're seeing in this channel, please consider subscribing and clicking that notification bell to avoid the usual YouTube shenanigans. Share the video, but most importantly, never stop gaming, but don't let gaming get in the way of your hopes and dreams. Bye everyone.